We'll begin our limnology journey today, starting with California's Lake Berryessa, a reservoir created by the Monticello Dam. Now, the dam has an interesting feature, a unique type of spillway called a glory hole, supposedly after the morning glory flower, also known as a bellmouth spillway. So we have a picture up here. So here we see Lake Berryessa, and here's the glory hole. So you can see that when the water level of the reservoir is too high, the water level will spill over the sides of the spillway, and the water will be tunneled away. We have a video. How does the glory hole work? We have a video of the glory hole in action. So here you can see the water spilling over the sides. In particular, this glory hole is 72 feet in diameter and has a drop of 200 feet before it makes a sharp turn and releases into the river below the dam, on the lower side of the dam. In 1997, interestingly, a person was actually sucked in this glory hole. and she ended up dying, sorry. That's very serious. Witnesses said that the woman swam up to the side of this spillway and actually grabbed onto the side for about 20 minutes before being sucked in. So this was, a moment of carelessness, but it's still pretty horrifying. It seems that for once the glory hole didn't have a happy ending. Okay. And this isn't the only glory hole that exists. Let's start calling it a bellmouth spillway. Oh, here you can see the water pretty forcefully coming out at the lower end of the glory hole. This isn't the only glory hole that exists. So here's Lady Bower Reservoir in Derbyshire, England. Here's Hungry Horse Dam in Montana. And here's Cavalo dos Conchos in Portugal, all with glory holes. Glory holes are everywhere, it seems. Let's actually start talking about something else. Next, we'll move over to British Columbia's beautiful Spotted Lake, which has spots. So why does it look like that? Good. So in the winter, you can see it looks like a more typical lake. But by the summer, a lot of the water evaporates, which creates these separate pools with high concentrations of fun minerals like magnesium sulfate, calcium sulfate, and sodium sulfate. So the mineral content of each pool can vary slightly from pool to pool. So that explains why some of these pools are so differently colored. You theoretically could walk on this white part of the lake if you received permission from the owners, which you probably wouldn't get because the owners are Native Americans that view the lake as sacred. But here's a bear doing just that. I guess you can do whatever you want when you're a bear. Did you know that there used to be a sixth Great Lake? On March 6, 1998, President Bill Clinton signed a bill regarding a reauthorization of the National Sea Grant College Program, which funds research, education, conservation, and the like for the Great Lakes and for the ocean. Contained within is a single line. The term Great Lakes includes Lake Champlain in between Vermont and New York. They did this so that the neighboring state of Vermont could access funds for research, education, conservation, and the like, normally designated for states that border an ocean or a Great Lake. This was met with a pretty big uproar. To be fair, Lake Champlain is pretty big. It's the 13th largest lake in the United States by surface area, but I guess it's 490 square miles of surface area is pretty puny compared to even Lake Ontario, the smallest of the Great Lakes, with its 7,320 square miles of surface area. Representative Stephen C. LaTourette from Ohio even suggested renaming Lake Champlain as Lake Plain Cham. Brutal. Congress voted to revoke Lake Champlain's status as a Great Lake just 18 days after the original bill, but they still gave University of Vermont access to Sea Grant funding, which is nice. Oh well, I guess Lake Champlain doesn't have it as bad as Lake St. Clair, which is sandwiched right in between Lake Huron and Lake Erie, helping to connect the two lakes, by the way. And despite being the 15th largest lake in the United States and being an integral part of the Great Lakes system, Lake St. Clair is also not usually considered a Great Lake. I guess it's a good lake at best. You can see by this map, Lake St. Clair compared to Lake Erie, not only is it smaller by surface area, it's also not very deep at all, with an average depth of just 11 feet. Poor Lake St. Clair. What's the largest lake anyways? By surface area, not volume. Sorry, Lake Baikal. The largest lake is often considered Lake Superior. But wait, Michigan and Lake Huron are technically, hydraulically speaking, one single lake because of the 5-mile-wide Strait of Mackinac that keeps the two lakes in equilibrium. So water flows from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron, and from Lake Huron to Michigan in both directions. So what actually separates the two lakes other than an arbitrary line? And Lake Michigan-Huron has a larger surface area than Lake Superior. But wait, why are we only considering freshwater lakes? I think most people would consider the Great Salt Lake a lake, for example. Well, if you include salt water, then the largest lake might be the Caspian Sea. I mean, it doesn't connect to the oceans, so it's a lake, right? Or is it an inland sea? Actually, the question of whether the Caspian is a lake or a sea is actually more important than you might think, because if it's a sea, then it's probably subject to international law regarding international waters. But if it's a lake, then the surrounding littoral countries would likely have more over control over the lake and its resources. So, I don't know. Is there a reason that it can't be both a lake and a sea? Or maybe it's neither. But wait, why are we only considering lakes on planet Earth? On the moon Titan, which is a moon of Saturn, sits a 400,000 square mile lake called the Kraken Mare, which is bigger than the Caspian Sea. I mean, Kraken Mare isn't made up of water, but instead hydrocarbons such as liquid methane, but it is still a liquid body, and Wikipedia calls it a lake, so good enough for me. Here's a artist's depiction of the Kraken Mare, what it would look like if you were floating on it. That's pretty cool. Now let's switch from the largest surface area to the deepest lake in the United States. Sorry, Lake Baikal. Crater Lake in the United States is the deepest lake in the United States. Did anyone used to think as a kid that the deepest lake in the United States was Lake Superior? Not only is Lake Superior not the deepest lake, but it's not even the second deepest. Lake Tahoe is. And Lake Superior isn't even the third deepest. Lake Chelan is in Washington. What an oddly shaped lake, by the way. Anyways, Crater Lake. I swear, the vibes of this lake are just weird. I could talk a lot about Crater Lake probably, but I want to focus on one weird fact about Crater Lake. The mysterious old man of the lake, which is a 30-foot tall tree stump, which has been floating vertically in Crater Lake since at least 1896. I did find a picture that shows the entire tree, and there's a man standing on top of the tree for scale. We know that the old man can travel with sometimes surprising speed across the lake. In between July 1st and September 30th, 1938, under the observation of the naturalist John Doerr, the old man was observed to have traveled at least 62.1 miles. Here is the path in between August 1st and September 1st. It can be virtually anywhere in the lake, as you could see. It constantly changes location from day to day. Boat captains have to constantly communicate its location to avoid the navigational hazard. And this is just weird. In 1988, during a submarine expedition of Crater Lake, the old man was moored in place near Wizard Island, which is what this is called. Right? It was fixed in place to avoid the navigational hazard that the old man could present to the submarine. Soon after the old man was secured in place, a storm rolled in that made launching the submarine impossible. Apparently, it even started snowing, even though it was August. It was only after releasing the log that the storm stopped, which that is a little weird. I mean, it's probably a coincidence, though, because the other explanation is that the log controls the weather. But there are a lot of questions, like, why is it not decayed? Why is it floating vertically and not horizontally? Why is it not washed up in shore? And if all of the conditions are right for keeping this log floating like this, which they clearly are, why aren't there other vertical trees in Crater Lake as well? Why is it the only one? I don't know. I mean, floating logs aren't necessarily unique to Crater Lake. For example, in the great state of Washington, Spirit Lake was affected, let's say, by the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which you can see right here. So here's the view from Mount St. Helens from Spirit Lake. In the months preceding the eruption, it was clear that something was wrong. Notably, a bulge started forming on the north side of Mount St. Helens, created by rising magma, and it was growing fast, sometimes by 5 feet in a single day. Eventually, on May 18th, 1980, when the bulge reached a height of over 450 feet, there was a 4.1 magnitude earthquake that triggered a landslide on the unstable north side of the volcano where the bulge was. The largest landslide in recorded history, by the way. So the landslide sped north towards Spirit Lake at well over 100 miles per hour. The landslide exposed the high-pressure gas and magma in the volcano, which exploded outwards laterally. I think normally when you think of a volcano, I think most people would imagine the ash exploding upwards instead of sideways. But Mount St. Helens exploded sideways, northwards, causing a pyroclastic flow of gas, ash, and pumice that traveled laterally to the north at almost the speed of sound. And all of this was directed at poor little Spirit Lake, right in the path of all of this. So here we can see a little simulation. Spirit Lake is at the top right here. All this landslide racing into Spirit Lake, displacing the water. Here you see at the bottom left, Spirit Lake. Some pretty serious stuff. So yeah, the landslide displaced the water of Spirit Lake, creating a several 100-foot high wave. The water traveled up the mountain slopes to the north. Eventually, much of the water came rushing back. Now, the initial blast had initially flattened thousands and thousands of trees. All this stuff flowing into Spirit Lake carried with it many of the downed trees into the lake. And to this day, almost 45 years later, thousands and thousands of floating logs still remain in Spirit Lake. You can see this mass on Google Earth. We have this picture is right after the eruption. You can see Spirit Lake looking pretty worse for wear, I would say. And this picture was taken in 2012. You can see the thousands of logs. You can see that the entire lake isn't covered, though. The eruption completely changed the shape and depth of Spirit Lake, making the lake shallower and broader. So the old Spirit Lake before the eruption is this outline in blue. And the new Spirit Lake after the eruption, the outline is in white. So you can see that the surface area actually increased and it became broader. You can see at the bottom, too, the new Spirit Lake depth at the top and the depth of the old Spirit Lake. You can see that it's much shallower. So it became much shallower and broader because of all the stuff that flowed into it. Another thing that's interesting is the debris from the eruption actually blocked Spirit Lake's only outlet to the Toutle River. And so after the eruption, the water of Spirit Lake started to rise. And within a few years, people realized that if the water level became so high that it overflowed the blockage in between Spirit Lake and the Toutle River, that it would cause the blockage to collapse, which would unleash a massive flood, which isn't great because people live downstream. So they put in this tunnel to drain some of the water in Spirit Lake. The only problem was that because the tunnel was constructed super fast, because the high water was kind of an emergency at the time, the tunnel was kind of shoddily built and requires expensive repairs every once in a while in order to prevent a catastrophe. And to make it worse, this is a very geologically active area, believe it or not. So that puts a lot of stress on the tunnel. And they just started recently talking about, hey, maybe we should put in like a more permanent solution. I think that sounds like a good idea. Another thing I find interesting are recursive lakes. Recursive lakes. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. Nettilling Lake is the largest lake on an island. Specifically, it's on Baffin Island in Canada. It's also the 30th largest lake by surface area in the world, which is pretty impressive for a lake on an island. We can go a step further, though. We can go a step further. Lake Manitou is the largest lake on an island in a lake. Specifically, Lake Manitou is on Manitoulin Island, which is in Lake Huron. Already, we're getting pretty lake crazy. But we can go a step further. Going back to Nettilling Lake, we could see if we zoom out that Nettilling Lake actually has in it an island, which has on it a lake. It actually has a bunch of lakes, but I think this is supposedly the biggest lake. So we have a lake on an island in a lake on an island. What a mind bender. But we can go, believe it or not, we can go a step further. Going over to Yathkeed Lake in Canada. So we have Yathkeed Lake. We have in it an island. We have on that island a lake. We have in that lake an island. And on that island is a lake. So we have a lake on an island, and a lake on an island, in a lake. So there you go. So I thought we'd finish up the video by going over some silly lake names. Silly lake names. What I think must have happened here is that the person whose job it was to name lakes was running out of lake names. So another lake and another lake. That's what we went with. And another lake. Moving over to Minnesota, we have Lake Full of Fish, which I guess is a direct translation of the native Ojibwe language name. I feel like if you want to respect the Ojibwe name. You would just say it in Ojibwe normally. Next, we have the unfortunately named Big Dick Lake and its neighbor, the probably even more unfortunately named Little Dick Lake. Oh, poor Little Dick Lake. But I would say that both are outshined by the nearby Jack the Horse Lake. On a similar vein, we have this lake, which I don't know that I can say the name of. Clitty Lake. That's what we went with. Our next lake, which is also in Minnesota, by the way. Our next lake is Big Too Much Lake. Am I having a stroke? Big Too Much Lake. That's the name. On a similar vein, over here, we have Big Ass Lake, which, I mean, I don't think this is even like particularly big. But okay, whatever. Over in the Carolinas, we have Alcohol and Drug Abuse Lake, which I think was actually named for a rehab center that was on the shore. I think it's actually, they have a different name these days. This lake has a different name now because the cowards changed the name, which is disappointing. But it was at one point called Alcohol and Drug Abuse Lake. And our final lake of the video, Elephant Butte Reservoir, which is the largest lake in New Mexico, right north of Truth or Consequences, which is named after a game show. That's too much to get into, though. So yeah, I guess that's where we end the video, on Elephant Butte.